Welcome to part 2 of this presentation of Alan Carr's Easy Way to Stop Smoking online seminar. In part 1, we introduced you to Alan and his method. We looked at some of the problems associated with willpower, and we touched on a couple of the myths that are associated with smoking. Now we're going to take a detailed look at smoking from a smoker's perspective. Let's start with the most obvious aspects of smoking, the smell and the taste. We'll start with smell and we'll move on to taste. In our seminars, I would say that around 90% of smokers tell us that they find the smell of smoke, frankly, pretty offensive. The rest say it's either okay or sometimes that they even enjoy it. But if it's the smell we're after, why not just light it and leave it? Why then breathe, the fumes into your lungs? I mean, incense smells a whole lot better than tobacco, but I don't see people trying to smoke incense sticks. You see, what is interesting here is that even people who claim to love the smell of smoke only appear to love the smell of some cigarettes. But how can this be? How can 2 cigarettes from the same pack smell different? When we examine this phenomenon a little bit more closely, we see something very interesting. It seems that cigarettes only smell quote-unquote good after an extended period where the smoker hasn't been able to smoke. Frankly, this is no more really than a Pavlovian response. Ivan Pavlov was a scientist, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist actually, who was working at the beginning of the 20th century, and he was very famous for a series of experiments that he ran with dogs. What he did is, whenever he fed these dogs, he rang a bell. And after many weeks of repeating this, what he found was that he could ring the bell, not put any food out, but the dogs would still salivate, because they now associated the sound of the bell with being fed. And I think this is exactly the same with smokers. I think after an extended period where you haven't been able to smoke, you get a whiff of smoke, and a bit like Pavlov's dogs, our brain goes ding! It kind of wakes up, my drug's about to be getting. So in a case, it's a little bit like Pavlov's dogs being fed, apart from this time you're being fed with a battery of nerve poisons. Now, back to this idea of smell being good. I mean, I love the smell of gasoline. But I never got to the stage where I carried a little vial of gasoline around with me everywhere I went so I could give it a quick sniff every half an hour. I mean, a smell is only a smell. I mean, let's face it, this is North America. If cigarette smoke smelt good, someone would bottle it and sell it. You know, I don't know, odor nicotine or tobacco-scented incense burners or something like this. I don't think so. So it's probably more realistic to say that for some people, at certain times of the day or during certain occasions, tobacco is a meaningful smell. So rather than being a good or a bad one, it's a meaningful smell. What about taste? Some smokers claim to enjoy the taste of cigarettes. I mean, most don't. But frankly, I couldn't even tell you what they taste like. I mean, I smoked 60 a day for years. I couldn't tell you what they taste like. I mean, I could tell you what the aftertaste is like. It's absolutely disgusting. This is why so many people drink when they smoke or chew gum. And this is to get rid of the disgusting aftertaste. In fact, this is why menthol cigarettes exist. The menthol is designed to mask the taste of the smoke. In any case, even if the taste of cigarettes was absolutely fantastic, it still doesn't explain why we inhale. I mean, our taste buds are on our tongues, not in our lungs. If it were the taste we were after, we wouldn't inhale. Think about it this way. Let's say you're in a bar late at night and you run out of cigarettes. You go to the cigarette machine and they never have your brand. It's, I don't know, it's like a law of physics or something like this. So what do you say? Do you say to yourself, well, okay, then I won't smoke then? Of course not. You will buy what is in that machine and you will smoke it. I mean, you know, let's be blunt, smokers would rather smoke camel dung than nothing at all. Yeah, we don't smoke for the smell or the taste, to be perfectly honest. But think about it, I mean, what's your favorite food? Steak? Lobster? Good old cheeseburger? Something like this? I bet you don't get in a panic, though, when you can't have a cheeseburger or where you can't have a steak. I mean, do you have to carry 20 cheeseburgers around with you everywhere you go, just in case you run out? Of course not. It doesn't bother you in the slightest. If we were smoking just for the taste, why do we get in such a panic when we can't light up? It just doesn't make any sense. In fact, one of the actual definitions of nicotine addiction, I think is the one that's used actually by the American Cancer Society, is, quote, tolerance of the taste and smell of cigarettes. What they're actually saying here is that by the time a teenager has learnt how to tolerate this disgusting smell and taste, it's a classic sign that they're hooked. This actually makes a lot more sense to me, because I remember when I was a youngster how hard I had to work to get hooked in the first place. And then, of course, you spend the rest of your life trying to quit. For me, this is one of the great ironies with respect to smoking. It actually takes quite a lot of willpower to learn how to smoke in the first place. Our first cigarettes, oh boy. I remember mine so clearly. I was dizzy and nauseous and coughing and spluttering, and frankly my experience wasn't so very different from many of yours. But you know what? And of course these symptoms, the nausea and so on, I mean, this is our body screaming at us. Get this stuff out of me. But if you continue to force it in, if you ignore the warning signs, our body has to learn how to tolerate, how to accommodate this battery of poisons. And the way our body achieves this is by dialing down the sensitivity on our sense of smell and on our sense of taste. It's the only way you can keep smoking. I mean, if you retain the smell and taste that you have as a non-smoker, you can't smoke. It's too overwhelming. If we're being honest here, I think it's probably easier to argue that we smoke despite the smell and despite the taste, not because of it. What about some of the other reasons that we give to justify our smoking? What about the Freudian analysis for smoking? That the cigarette is a substitute for the mother's breast or something like this. I don't know. Even when I was a smoker, this one didn't sound particularly good to me. Maybe it sounds good when you're doing Psych 101, but when you scratch the surface of this belief system, it doesn't really make very much sense. I mean, the truth is that most of us start smoking to show how grown up we are, how adult and sophisticated and mature we are, which, if you think about it, is the exact opposite of wanting to regress back to your mother's breast. Yeah, it really doesn't make sense. For me, this is Freud, an extremely intelligent man, trying to rationalize something that I think that deep down he understands is a truly irrational behavior. Think about it. I mean, you don't need a dummy or a pacifier. That's not why you smoke. Yeah. What about the hand-mouth connection? Or this something to do with my hands argument? Or this oral gratification? I think these are all part of the same family of belief systems, and I think that we can deal with them using the same basic logic. If the cigarette is just something to stick in your hand, then why light it? I mean, think about it. The cost of cigarettes these days, you'd save a fortune. But we do light it, don't we? We always light it. And this hand-mouth movement here, I mean, surely if there is something fundamentally pleasurable in moving your hand from here to here, then it's going to be pleasurable whether you've got a cigarette in it or not. And I could stand here all day doing this. Nothing's going to happen. I'll try the other hand, shall I? Yeah? No, nothing. And this also goes for this oral gratification argument. I mean, if it's just something to stick in your mouth, then why light it? Again, cost of cigarettes these days, you'd save a fortune. You'd only have to change it when the filter got too soggy. One pack would last, 3 weeks or something like this. But we do light it, don't we? We always light it. Yeah, it doesn't add up. It really doesn't make sense. And this brings me to the next attribute of smoking, the smoke going down into your lungs. Some people call it the draw, the drag. Do you enjoy this feeling? Or do you sense that you smoke to get this feeling? If so, then can you describe why it's pleasurable? I couldn't. Yet other physical pleasures are very easy to define, very easy to explain. I mean, being stroked or rubbed or scratched. This is a very nice feeling, very pleasant feeling for most people. But we can explain why it's pleasurable. The hairs on our arms are linked subdermally to nerve endings. When you stimulate the hair, you stimulate the nerve ending. This sends an electrical impulse to the brain. The brain releases dopamine, and the brain says, ah, that feels great. Can you explain the same process for a cigarette? I couldn't. Think about it. Why would inhaling hot carbon monoxide and a battery of neurotoxins, why would this be pleasurable? The first cigarette of the day, I definitely feel, think that you feel the smoke going down then. But to be honest with you, for the rest of the day, I was completely unaware of this feeling. Apart from sometimes the one after dinner, I would get that feeling again. You see, the point I'm trying to make here is that if we smoked to get this feeling of the hot smoke going down into our lungs, then we would probably only smoke a couple of cigarettes a day. The more you smoke, the less you get this feeling. It just doesn't make sense. Actually, perhaps I should explain what is what this feeling is created by. I mean, the reason that people get this feeling of the hot smoke going down into their lungs, I mean, particularly with the first cigarette of the day, is very simple. When you've been asleep, your lungs have been repairing themselves. So when you wake up in the morning, you're smoking on sort of quote-unquote virgin lungs. And as the first couple of drags go down, you can really feel that the hot smoke, the temperature of the smoke burning as it goes down. But after a couple of drags, your airways get coated with tar. And this sensation goes away completely. So the point that I'm trying to make here is a very simple one. If we smoke to get this feeling, we would only smoke when we got that feeling. The fact is that we smoke all the time, whether we get this feeling or not. It really just doesn't make sense. And this, of course, incidentally, actually, is the whole scam behind light and mild cigarettes. This is a so-called full-flavor cigarette that was produced by one of the major manufacturers. And this is a so-called light or mild cigarette made by the same manufacturer. Now, the tobacco in these two cigarettes is absolutely identical. There is no such thing as low tar or low nicotine tobacco. All tobacco is the same. The only difference between these two cigarettes is the length of the filter. What you will see is that the filter of the extra light or the ultralight cigarette is a good deal longer than the filter from the regular cigarette. And what this does is it gives the smoke more time to cool down before it enters the lungs. And this is what gives the illusion of being a milder or a lighter taste. It really is nothing to do with the activity of the smoke. It's to do with the temperature of the smoke. The cooler the smoke, the stronger the illusion of mildness. The hotter the smoke, the more the sensation of harshness. So the shorter the filter, the higher the temperature. This is the only difference between these two cigarettes. To be honest with you, not that the filter makes any difference at all. I just used to inhale deeper or smoke more or smoke it further down the butt or just break the filter off anyway. If breathing hot fumes into our lungs was pleasurable, then there are many other ways of getting this pleasure. For example, you would welcome the opportunity to inhale barbecue smoke in the yard. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the smell of barbecue smoke. But can you imagine choosing to inhale it into your lungs? Or you could walk in and out of a sauna. I mean, the air in the sauna is much hotter than the outside air, and it really burns your lungs for the first couple of breaths. I don't see people walking in and out of saunas 20 times a day for pleasure. It just doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't make any sense. What about image? I mean, this is why the vast majority of us start to smoke. All the cool girls seem to smoke. All the tough guys seem to smoke. But is this why we're still smoking today? Nah, of course not. In fact, I think it's probably easier to argue today that the image of being a smoker is an extremely negative one. Oh boy, and the anti-smoking campaigners have really seen to it that most smokers are made to feel embarrassed and ashamed and guilty. It's ironic, you know, smoking and smokers for years were considered to be the most sociable of people, and yet today they are considered, wrongly in my view, the most antisocial of all addicts. James Dean, John Wayne, Steve McQueen, Marlene Dietrich, they weren't made to look cool, tough and sexy because they smoked. It's the other way around. They made smoking look cool, tough and sexy. It was all so different way back then, wasn't it? You could smoke anywhere, couldn't you? Buses, taxis, trains, planes, bars, bingo halls, schools, even some hospitals. If you went to a friend's house, you didn't even have to ask them before you lit up. Boy, haven't things gone full circle. These days, many cities and towns are actually framing legislation that will prevent you from smoking in your own home or in your own car. These days, smoking for the image, it's a little bit like drinking a bottle of gin to get sober. It just doesn't make any sense. You might argue that you don't care what society says or thinks about you. You're your own person, you play by your own rules. You're a bit of a rebel and, you don't care who knows it. But how do you show your rebellious nature? By becoming a slave. How do you show your uniqueness? By joining a club with 1 billion enforced members, the vast majority of whom want to quit. This is not a good way of showing your rebellious streak. As a youngster, you might have chosen to rebel, but as an adult smoker, you certainly aren't choosing whether you smoke or not. If you had any choice whatsoever about this, you wouldn't be needing to watch this. You'd just quit smoking. In any case, who are you sending this message of rebellion to? I mean, I think as teenagers, we're trying to impress other teenagers. But who are we trying to impress now? And do non-smokers get the message? When non-smokers look at smokers, do they think, oh boy, what a free spirit, I wish I was more like that? Or did they just think it's all a bit sad? Do they see a drug addict, pure and simple? Smoking is so 20th century. Having dispensed with the standard arguments in defense of smoking, let's now look at the real reasons why people smoke. Alan used to call them the big four. Boredom, relaxation, concentration, and stress. These are the real reasons that people smoke. Yeah? Now let's deal with boredom first. If smoking relieved boredom, smokers would never be bored. Just because we smoke when we're bored, that doesn't mean that smoking relieves boredom. I mean, if every time I got bored I went and got myself a glass of water, would I begin to tell myself that there was a magic ingredient in water that was a medical cure for boredom? Of course not. It's just that going to get myself a glass of water provided a momentary distraction. But if we smoked to relieve boredom, we wouldn't smoke when we weren't bored. But we smoke all the time, whether we're bored or not. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, there is the question of whether smoking actually does relieve boredom. I mean, let's say I'm a smoker, and I'm sitting there and I think, oh boy, I'm bored. Oh, I know, I'll have a cigarette. So you light a cigarette. Ding! Ooh, I'm not bored anymore. How wonderful is that? I mean, when was the last time this happened to you? Never happened to me in 30 years of smoking. Before I was bored, and now I'm just bored and smoking. I mean, let's face it, smoking's hardly mind-absorbing, is it? Half the time you're smoking, you're barely even aware you've got one lit. I think that what we say, what we mean when we say that we smoke to relieve boredom, I think what we really mean is that sometimes when we're bored, going for a cigarette provides a bit of a distraction. But there's a bit of a contradiction here, because many smokers, myself included when I was a smoker, claim that smoking helps them concentrate. But when you need to concentrate, do you look for a distraction? Or do you look to get rid of distractions? You look to get rid of distractions, don't you, so that you can concentrate properly? Well, which one is it then? Is it a distraction when you're bored? Or does it remove distractions when you need to concentrate? Because it certainly can't do both. I mean, think about it this way. If smoking enhanced cognitive function, our brain performance, our memory, our creativity, any of these things, then smokers would be smarter than non-smokers. And I hate to be the one to break this news to you, but it ain't the case. like I said, you know, if you really think about it, if smoking enhanced our brain's performance, everybody that used their brain for a living would be a smoker. Doctors, researchers, surgeons, airline pilots, air traffic controllers. In fact, it would be mandatory for many of these people to smoke. The truth is, very, very few of these people smoke. And the ones that do, quite frankly, are less able for doing so. I mean, think about it. Would you want a brain surgeon to be dying for a cigarette while he was operating on you? I'm not sure I would. I smell a rat, and a pretty big one too. And there's another contradiction as well with stress and relaxation. People say, you don't want to know me. First thing in the morning, before I've had my first cigarette of the day, I'm barely even human. This thing, bang, it gives me that jolt that I need to get up and get on with life, take on the world, and so on. But then we say, well, the cigarette relaxes me. You know, if I'm in a stressful situation, the cigarette just kind of takes the edge off, enables me to enjoy myself. But these two things are complete opposites. What we're saying is that the first thing in the morning, we use the cigarette as a stimulant to try to get going. And then for the rest of the day, we use it as a relaxant to try to take the edge off. What kind of amazing drug is this? It doesn't really make sense, does it? I mean, if smoking relieved stress, smokers would be less stressed than non-smokers, correct? Is this the case? I would argue it's the opposite. If smoking aided relaxation, then smokers would be more relaxed than non-smokers. And chain smokers would be the most relaxed people on the planet, because they're getting all this relaxation. In reality, these are the least relaxed people on the planet, not the most relaxed. It is blatantly obvious to anyone that cares to think about this subject for more than 2 seconds that this one drug cannot have these two completely opposite effects. There are drugs that have more than one effect. They're called biphasic drugs. Nicotine isn't one of them. Think about it this way. I could sell you a pill that got you going in the mornings, that, you know, ready to take on the world, bang, bang, bang. And I could sell you a pill that relaxed you in stressful situations, just took the edge off. But if I said that the same pill would do both things, you'd call the cops. What I'm really saying here is that there is an awful lot about smoking that upon closer examination genuinely doesn't appear to make sense. You see, very, very early on in our smoking lives, we give the cigarette power. We put it up here on this pedestal, and we give it all this power, and we learn the smoking script. It'll help me relax. It'll help me concentrate. It'll keep me thin. It'll help me cope with stress. What we ignore are the many very obvious contradictions. I mean, if smoking's supposed to keep you thin, then why are there so many overweight smokers? Your sixth instruction is to stop giving the cigarette the credit. Let's, take this cigarette down off this pedestal. And let's peel away these myths and illusions, and let's, find out what's really going on here, what's really behind this thing. Now, we've reached a very important point. What I'm saying is that no smoker genuinely enjoys smoking. We tell ourselves we do, but really only because we have to. But when you strip all of these myths and illusions away, no smoker genuinely enjoys smoking. Now, some people find this very, very difficult to accept. Our logical brain somehow just can't accept that we would put up with all of these horrific disadvantages of being a smoker when there are no upsides to smoking. Our brains just cannot put up with this. But that doesn't mean that this is true. That doesn't mean that this belief is true. Now, I know that you've all come here today watching this webcast with your own thoughts and your own beliefs about smoking and about quitting. All I'm asking you to do is to put those thoughts to the side for a couple of hours. I'm about to explain to you a different way of looking at smoking, Alan Carr's way of looking at smoking. And at the end of the webcast, you guys can decide which one makes more sense. Whether what you believe about smoking makes more sense, or what Alan says about smoking makes more sense. And in order to do this properly, you have to have an open mind. And this is your 7th instruction, to have an open mind. All I'm asking you to do is to consider the possibility, just the possibility, that you have never particularly enjoyed smoking. That there's another explanation. And that this explanation sort of makes perfect sense of the whole thing. And in order to do this properly, you have to have an open mind. And that means challenging everything you know or think you know about smoking. So instead of just trotting out the old cliches about smoking, you need to challenge them. Like, I don't know. I really enjoy the one after a meal. I mean, what smoker has not said this? I would say every smoker on the planet has said this thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Well, instead of just accepting this as gospel, challenge it. Try to think back over all of the thousands and thousands and thousands of meals that you've had in your lifetime. And try and think of one occasion where you've sat there and thought, wow, this cigarette is absolutely gorgeous. The wine, the food, my friends, my family, the music, all of these are distractions, preventing me from enjoying this gorgeous cigarette. I should have just stayed at home and smoked. Would have been much more fun. Doesn't happen, does it? In fact, quite the opposite. I'm sure you can remember tons of times where your need to smoke has ruined a meal or a social occasion. You're supposed to be relaxed and enjoying yourself, but from halfway through the main course, you're looking around thinking, why can't these people eat properly? You're praying that nobody will order dessert, nobody will order coffee, so you can get out and smoke. Now, how would a non-smoker look at that situation? Wouldn't a non-smoker look at that situation and say, that person's need to smoke is absolutely ruining their enjoyment of this meal? But as smokers, what do we say? Oh, I really enjoy the one after a meal. Don't you see that these are really just two ways of looking at the same information? A smoker's perspective and a non-smoker's perspective? And when it comes to smoking, perspective really is everything. The author, Wayne Dyer, said something I feel is very profound. He said that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And this is so true, particularly when it comes to smoking and cigarettes. If you keep seeing the cigarette from a smoker's perspective, you'll have a desire to smoke. And you'll need to use willpower to try to overcome that desire. But if you can shift your perspective, something amazing happens. If you're prepared to shift your perspective, you'll be able to see smoking the way a non-smoker sees it. And from that perspective, when you see what they see, you'll literally have no desire to smoke. And of course, with no desire to smoke, it doesn't take willpower not to. I suppose that's really the whole objective of this webcast. It's not about how to stop smoking. It's about how to become a happy non-smoker. By learning to see smoking from this new perspective, which, let's face it, is a reality-based perspective. Now, having mentioned the one after a meal as being somehow an especially enjoyable cigarette, perhaps now is a good time to talk about these so-called special cigarettes. Like most smokers, your fear of quitting is probably not based around the 15 or 20 a day that you smoke that you're barely even aware of. It's a fear of missing out on what we perceive to be special cigarettes. So let's talk about these so-called special cigarettes and try to understand what makes them seem so special. What are your special cigarettes? The first of the day? The one with a meal or after a meal? With alcohol? With coffee? How about the one after the gym? Or the one after a long flight? Or the one after a long meeting, or taking a break at work, or, you know, just carving out a bit of me time when you're looking after the kids, or as a reward, or after sex. When you understand how nicotine works, you will see why some of these cigarettes appear to be more special than others. But first we have to go back to basics. Why do you think a packet of cigarettes is this size? Well, it seems very obvious to me that it's been designed to fit in a human hand, or a human pocket, or a purse. Can you imagine if a packet of cigarettes was this size? It would be a real hassle to smoke. You couldn't fit it in a pocket, you couldn't fit it in a bag. It would be a real hassle to smoke. Now, nothing has been left to chance with the design of a cigarette. The tobacco industry is one of the most research-driven, energetic research companies around. Tobacco companies, basically, I mean, the way they describe cigarettes is as a nicotine delivery device. I mean, this is how the industry themselves describe cigarettes. Now, tobacco companies want smokers really to buy a pack a day, like it's an automatic purchase, like, I don't know, buying a pint of milk, a newspaper, and so on and so forth. So they want you to build it into your regular routine. Now, they figure that you're going to be asleep for around 8 hours, awake for 16. Now, that means that to buy a packet of cigarettes every day, they have to put enough nicotine in each cigarette to make you want to smoke about once every 45 minutes. Some people metabolize nicotine faster than others, end up smoking more than a pack a day. Some people metabolize nicotine more slowly than others, end up smoking less. But the average person's metabolic rate will require them to smoke about once every 45 minutes, which brings you to a pack a day. So back to this idea of special cigarettes. The average smoker will perceive any gap between cigarettes of longer than 45 minutes. They will begin to experience this as mild deprivation. So bearing this in mind, let's look again at these so-called special cigarettes. You can see that many of them, the first of the day, after a break, or during a break, after a long meeting, after a long flight, after a meal, you can see that many of these so-called special cigarettes come after a period of longer than 45 minutes, sometimes a lot longer. Could it be that what we're really enjoying in this situation is not the cigarette, but the ending of the state of feeling deprived that you can't smoke? You see, smokers give the cigarette the credit for making them feel better, but shouldn't they be blaming the previous cigarette for making them feel deprived and anxious in the first place? The so-called special cigarettes that don't meet this 45-minute criteria meet another criteria. These situations, these special cigarettes, are smoked in situations that are enjoyable anyway, whether you smoke or not. And the cigarette is kind of sneaking a ride on the back of something that a non-smoker can enjoy without smoking. So, taking a break, playing golf, drinking alcohol, taking a coffee break, so on and so forth. These are all things that non-smokers can enjoy without the cigarette. So it cannot be the cigarette that is creating the pleasure. So, to summarize, when we look at these so-called special cigarettes, they either come immediately after an extended period of abstinence, in which case what you're really enjoying is not the cigarette, but the ending of the state of needing that cigarette. Or they come at a time when you're doing something that's enjoyable anyway, whether you smoke or not, and the cigarette is kind of sneaking a ride on the back of something that's enjoyable anyway. And the really special cigarettes come at a combination of these times, after an extended period where you haven't been able to smoke, and when you're doing something that you feel is very enjoyable. It's absolutely critical to understand this point. So let me illustrate the illusion of these special cigarettes in a little bit more detail. Let's say that there are two guys, okay? One's a smoker and one's a non-smoker. But apart from this, these guys are absolutely identical in every other way. And let's say these guys work together in, I don't know, say baggage handling out at one of the big airports. So it's tough, urgent, time-sensitive work, but at the same time it's kind of a bit boring, a bit monotonous, and it's tough working conditions. It's baking hot in the summer, it's freezing cold in the winter. And let's say that every couple of hours these guys get to take a break. Now, how do you think the non-smoker would be feeling on his break? Happy, relaxed, content, comfortable, confident? These are words that people would use to describe the way this guy's feeling. Now, how would the smoker be feeling on his break if he wasn't allowed to smoke? Would he be feeling better than the non-smoker? The same? Or worse? I would argue that he'd feel worse. He'd be, happy to be on a break, but at the same time he'd feel a little bit anxious and a little bit edgy, wishing he could smoke. So, the non-smoker is up here feeling happy and relaxed, and the smoker is down here feeling a little bit anxious and a little bit edgy. Now, what happens if we remove the smoking restriction and you let this guy lie down? Then what happens? Well, it's easy. Ding! Now he's happy. Now he feels content. Now he feels comfortable. He feels actually like the non-smoker. Now, does he feel better than the non-smoker? No, of course not. I mean, it's not like you smoke a cigarette, you're not allowed to operate heavy machinery for 4 hours or drive a car. I mean, you just get on with your life. So it's not that the cigarette makes him feel better than a non-smoker. It's probably more that he thinks it does. So what we're saying here is really, really simple. The previous cigarette created this gap between feeling normal and feeling a little bit anxious and a little bit edgy. And then the next cigarette fills that gap to provide the illusion of pleasure. But what happens when he puts the cigarette out? Then what happens? Well, of course, over time, he begins to sink back down. So 45 minutes later, he's back down here feeling a little bit anxious and a little bit edgy. So what does he do? He lights another cigarette. And by lighting another cigarette, he gets to feel like the non-smoker again. But as soon as he puts it out, he begins to withdraw from the nicotine. So soon he's back down here. He needs a third cigarette, a fourth cigarette, a fifth cigarette. And this is, in fact, this is really all there is to smoking. We smoke cigarettes so that we can temporarily get to feel like a non-smoker. But by smoking to remove these feelings, all we're really guaranteeing is that they'll keep coming back again and again and again. You see, you have to see smoking as it really is. Smoking is an endless chain of futile attempts to remove the slightly empty, anxious feeling created by withdrawing from the nicotine contained in the previous cigarette. And by removing this very mild symptom, we temporarily get to feel like a non-smoker. Because, of course, a non-smoker doesn't have this feeling. In essence, we smoke so that we can feel like non-smokers. And once you understand this very simple point, quitting becomes ridiculously easy. Because instead of seeing the cigarette as the solution, we can begin to see it as the problem. We will talk much more about this point in part 3 of the webcast. See you there.